Most games have multiple ways to achieve victory, whether that's collaboratively or player versus player. Players in Magic the Gathering might argue about which decks they prefer and which cards they think are better or worse, but what ultimately matters is, did it achieve the goal? Did you win? In tabletop role-playing games, the goal is to tell the best story that we can. Even in a game about crawling through a mega dungeon, the goal is to tell the best story we can about these characters in that mega dungeon. And just like our cousins the writers, we argue about the best way to tell a story. Stephen King and J.R.R. Tolkien have very different approaches to writing. King improvises practically everything, while Tolkien noodles out even minute details, and there is no one that is going to tell either Tolkien or King that they are bad writers. RPGs are young as a hobby, about 50 years old. If you want to go back to the birth of wargaming, that's 200 years ago. Music may be older than our species. Even the modern way of writing music is already 1,000 years old. Plato was holding formalized lecture on the nature of stories 2,500 years ago, and we are still finding opportunities to argue about things like, is Star Wars science fiction or fantasy? Maybe we need a new term, sci-fantasy. We as tabletop role-playing games are still discovering new genres, new ways of play, and new ways to discuss what we like and we don't like. And there are differences and preferences that most people are not aware of until a member of their table plops down a new RPG with different thoughts about how to divide the different responsibilities of story.
I just picked up this RPG. It's everything that I've wanted in a game. And since I think it's fun, I'm sure you'll think it's fun, and we'll all agree on what is fun.
Hi, I'm James, and on this channel I talk about the things that I think about, plan, and plot for my tabletop role-playing games. If you like that kind of content, then there's buttons down there for like and subscribe. Last week, well, actually probably more like a month or so ago by the time you're seeing this video, a couple of my players tried to change how the game setting works. Not characters in-world taking actions to try to change the world, but players at a table trying to change the game setting. And it's me and my friends, so we had a quick discussion and we moved on to fun and good times. But we did revisit an old discussion that I've seen find new life elsewhere. I learned it as the story divide. The story divide is not a new argument. To the best of my knowledge, it really started to metastasize in the 90s with Vampire the Masquerade, and then really got going with The Forge in the early 2000s, 2010s. It roughly describes that there are two camps with different ideas about who controls the different elements of the story: protagonist, antagonist, setting, and plot. The first is from D&D and its progeny. I really just wanted to use the word progeny, it sounds draconic. The philosophy of the story game is that the best way for players to have a good time and tell the best story is for everyone to be equally involved in all aspects of the story. The players in these games do typically have a character, but their control extends beyond the character themselves. They often have meta powers, meta currencies that allow them to change other things. They can introduce whole new characters, they can introduce new plot lines, they can change the room that they're in. Sometimes they can even change the setting itself. Daggerheart is the first game since like Vampire the Masquerade in the 90s to leave the story game niche and bring this all for one and one for all approach to mainstream tables. Yes, other games existed. I know about Powered by the Apocalypse and Blades in the Dark, and those are probably the most famous, but other games like Allison's Missing and Fiasco were largely played among people that were dedicated to that type of game. Players of things like D&D either didn't know that they existed or chose to stick with what they already knew. And that kind of self-selection, opting in and opting out, is how they developed the stereotype of theater kid games. Daggerheart tries to put one foot in each camp, and some people are finding that friends who say that they love story like a different approach to constructing a narrative, and that dislike of the approach is being mistranslated as a dislike of narrative.
You said that you like the stories in the game. This game is all about creating better stories together. If you like stories, then you should like this game.
When we talk about games, we tend to grab for the same words: story, plot, character, improvisation, emergence, like flags trying to stake territory. The problem with something like that is when you are choosing a word that the medium is kind of about, you are functionally saying that the other thing is not that. If you say that your game is story first or narrative first, you are kind of implying that the competition doesn't care about story, doesn't care about narrative. And as primarily a D20 fantasy player, I care very much about narrative. It is the most important thing to me in my games. I just arrive at it in a different manner. Not better or worse, just different. So instead of choosing some of these battleground words, I'm going to steal some words from music. Orchestral, harmonious, and counterpoint. When we talk about story in TTRPGs, we usually talk in terms of control between the dungeon master and the player. But to my mind, there's actually a third axis in this triforce of story, the publisher. Not in terms of like a game system, Dungeons and Dragons versus Daggerheart versus Blades in the Dark, but in terms of published campaign versus sandbox campaign. In a published campaign, there's very little room for you to change the narrative without giving up the convenience for which you bought the published campaign. It is going somewhere, and you're just along for the ride trying to perform that the best you can. Thus the name orchestrated. In an orchestra, they are playing music somebody else wrote. They may succeed or fail, the conductor and the musicians, but they're going to succeed or fail at performing the piece the way that it was written. Dungeons and Dragons as a game system is not orchestrated, but many of the published campaigns are. Take Curse of Strahd, for example. Strahd is the big bad. You are going to be facing Strahd. Maybe you help Arena, maybe you ignore her. Maybe your Strahd is female instead of male. Maybe your Sunsword is at the mill and not in the Abbey. None of those small changes are going to change the macro narrative. Strahd is the villain set up in Act 1. Defeating him is the climax of Act 3. And people love Curse of Strahd. It is by far the most talked about and popular campaign in the 25 years that I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons. So people must not hate orchestrated campaigns. I think there's comfort in knowing the goal, the tone, the villain, what's expected of you, and certainly the time length. If you only have 6 sessions to play, and you want to make sure that there is a guaranteed payoff, that you see a satisfying narrative, then an orchestrated campaign is there for you. The trade-off is that your freedom as a player and a dungeon master shrinks. You can't decide to romance Strahd or let him turn you.
Oh God, if he bites me again, I'm going to turn into a vampire. What am I objecting for? No, sure, yeah.
If you do strain at the boundaries of what the campaign was meant to accomplish and try to change it, you are signing the dungeon master up for a lot of work that they may not have been intending to do. They did pick a published campaign, and you are risking turning what was supposed to be 6 sessions of this kind of like limited story into 2 years of gameplay. Another way of looking at it is that you are covering somebody else's song. And covering somebody's song and changing it is always a little bit risky. For every Jeff Buckley's Hallelujah or Johnny Cash covering Nine Inch Nails' Hurt, there's Limp Bizkit covering The Who's Behind Blue Eyes or Miley Cyrus singing Black Dog. Some people may really like what you've done. Other people are really going to hate it. Are those people at your table? On the other side of the spectrum, we have the 2 free-form narrative styles. What I would call a harmonious game is any game that treats the players at the table closer to writers trying to tell a story than actors trying to portray characters in a story. Alice is Missing, Fiasco, Powered by the Apocalypse, even Daggerheart to some extent. Everyone in these games is equal, here to tell the best story that they can. If there is a game master, then they are much closer to a moderator than anything that is imbued with additional powers over the plot and special areas of the game. The mechanics in these games allow the players to manipulate the story at a meta level rather than the characters to be able to manipulate something in the world. Take, for example, hit points. That is not a meta currency. Sure, a character in a D&D world wouldn't know what a hit point is or a wound is, but they are aware that they just got clubbed on the head by a troll. And having something like hit points allows the character and the player to agree on a certain level of ow. In Blades of the Dark, on the other hand, it allows the player to spend stress to change the conditions of the story in a way that the character is probably not aware that they can do. Similarly, in Daggerheart, it encourages the game master to allow the player to spend currencies, hit points, stress, hope, to change the conditions of the story. The action in the cinematic world freezes while we discuss what should happen in the next scene. Another hallmark for me of these kind of harmonious games is the level to which they embrace failing forward. Again, using Blades in the Dark as an example, let's imagine that your character is trying to jump between some roofs, and they didn't make it. Instead of falling to their death, a consequence the player doesn't like, the player spends some stress. Instead, they catch the edge of the roof and the guard's attention. Now they deal with this new circumstance. That can lead to what is a immersion-breaking comedy of errors.
Oh, you failed to outrun the guards. Okay, well, there's a tussle on the top of the roof, and as they're pushing around, you accidentally fall off the roof. You can try to make a save, and if you succeed, then you can land in a dumpster at the bottom of the street. Oh, you failed. No, you missed the dumpster, but you don't die when you hit the hardened concrete 3 stories down. You fall and you snap your leg. Now you need to hobble away and see if you can hide within the crowd. Oh. You failed your stealth roll.
In these harmonious games, it's also less about your ability to be clever and solve a problem, because again, you're not just portraying a character, you are a writer controlling the entire meta story. If your character is in a situation where it would be really useful for them to have a stick of dynamite, but you didn't think to write one down on your character sheet, that's fine. You're not playing a character responsible for all their actions. You are a writer of a story. Let's just write a flashback scene to explain why your character has that stick of dynamite to blow open the safe so that they can steal all the treasure. Players in this kind of narrative style game, this harmonious style, prefer the freedom to create a plot rather than react to one, to create a world rather than to explore one. Unless an idea is truly absurd, the table is largely expected to just go along with it. The downside is that can slip into tonal chaos. The more egalitarian the game, the less power the Dungeon Master has to ensure a consistent tone. I love Inigo Montoya. I also love Game of Thrones. Inigo Montoya does not belong in Game of Thrones. I've played a couple of these games and I always come away with the same feeling. And while this might be a little editorial, I do not believe that I am that unique, that I have feelings that somebody else has not experienced playing these games. So, take this for a grain of salt, as it were. I sometimes feel like these games lack weight to the character's actions because there's not a neutral party, a dungeon master, that is coming up with challenges for me to then solve through the lens of my character. It's me as a player coming up with problem, and then me as a player coming up with solution. I just propose something and we go with it because I said it. And even if I have to spend a currency to do so, I don't feel like I'm sharing in the character's ultimate victory. I don't share the narrative weight of accomplishment from going from 0 to hero through all the journeys that it takes to get there. Strahd is introduced in Act 1, I go through the entire campaign. In Act 3, I finally get to defeat Strahd, the thing that I've been working for. And in a true writer's room, you can do that. Novelists and screenwriters do it all the time, but it's the kind of thing that takes them entire seasons or entire novels or series of novels to ultimately pay off in the end. Not just, like Bran Stark becomes king because, reasons. In music, counterpoint is when 2 different melodies are interdependent upon one another. Typically, they will each rise and fall in turn to allow the other to take center stage, but if you tried to separate them, they would be less than they are together. If there is a traditional form of Dungeons & Dragons, this is it. This is what Gygax and Arneson were doing back before there were published adventures. The Dungeon Master creates a world through their NPCs, their setting, and through their initial conflicts in the world. And then the players react to that. And the world reacts to what the players, through their characters, just did. At their best, this can feel like you're fully immersed in a fantasy world through the lens of your character, because you can only see it through your character, and the world does not answer to you. It has a will of its own. My wife compared this style of play to playing in a jazz trio. The Dungeon Master is the pianist of the trio, arguably the backbone, but they need the other 2 there, the bass player and the drummer, because they add to the performance. They don't take away from it. The Dungeon Master starts playing something, and from that there's a structure, a melody, chords, the time signature. But the magic happens when the Dungeon Master is willing to step back and let the others take the spotlight, take control of the story and do something. If everything is working right, those players or the performers take what the Dungeon Master set up and they make something that fits as if it was always meant to be there. They add to the story, to the world. They don't take away from it. I also picked counterpoint because something else probably came to mind. An argument. At their best in an argument, both sides are well-reasoned and they choose to see each other's perspective and then they come together to agree on a way forward. But that is difficult. Oftentimes things are said and damage is done. In a role-playing game of this style, the players must live with the fact that there is this entity, the Dungeon Master, that has authorial control over the world and that what their character does is within their control, but the consequences are not. And the Dungeon Master needs to run a world that feels fair, as if the consequences are a realistic response to the player's choices. If the Dungeon Master is unfair, antagonistic, restrictive, or petty, if the player is committed to a particular story for their character, the world and the dice be damned, then it doesn't just impact that player, it can impact the entire table. Most games aren't one or the other, they're somewhere in the middle. Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, two very counterpoint-style games, have meta-currencies to allow the players to override certain events, while Daggerheart allows the Game Master to control the world somewhat through its campaign frames. I have my favorite style. You probably do too. I learn what I prefer by playing the other games and playing with my players to figure out what they prefer. I think many people were excited by the prospect of Daggerheart getting their players to roleplay more, engage with the characters and how they interact with one another and get engaged with the lore. And for many players, I think it may very well do that. But it also allows the players to engage more in the world building. As my friend Peter on Tales from Elsewhere said, they grab onto the steering wheel and they get a little bit more control. And I think some people are discovering that some of the players don't want that control. They don't want to write the story. They want to explore the Game Master's world. And that's fine too. None of these is right or wrong. They're just different styles that are better for different circumstances and different groups and players. Yes, I would love to play Blade in the Dark with Scott Lynch, Brandon Sanderson, and George R.R. Martin, but not in their worlds. I want to explore the Cosmere, the world of the Gentlemen Bastards, or Westeros. I don't want to create it. Until next time, Dungeon Masters, remember you're a player too. Try to have some fun.